Hi, this is Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank in Delray Beach. This podcast is we are doing the next 45 pages today of After the Cataclysm, a book by Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman. The book's title has been forged. The U.S. government has forged this title to make it look like, a propaganda book when it is a historical review. And the actual title is Post-War Reconstruction and the Post-War Indochina and the Reconstruction of Imperial Ideology, the Political Economy of Human Rights, Volume 2. What we've done so far is we've discussed, all of the various methods by which the U.S. government, the mafia, racist, warmonger, war criminal, butchers of the United States government, including their presidents and congressional people, conducted a campaign of terrorism, American terrorism, and American, mass murder in Indochina against the Asian people of Indochina. The Indochinese were slaughtered in, ways that, even Hitler didn't do to the Jews. The Indochinese were given, vomiting gases, napalm, white phosphorus gases, sarin poisons, mustard gases, all sorts of, concoctions of poisoning research of the U.S., mass murdering, warmonger, war criminal, mafia, butchers. They did all sorts of things to the Indochinese. Hitler's war paled in comparison to these racist wars that the United States conducted in Indochina. The U.S. committed a genocide against the Vietnamese, Laotians, and Cambodians, and they refused to admit it. After doing this, politically, they, avoided addressing the issue, rejected aid requests, rejected the world calls for aid, were condemned at universally all war crimes tribunals. The U.S. government goes down as a group of, Nazi-like gangsters, complete racist American white, murderous, warmonger, war criminal, mafia butchers. We discussed the white phosphorus, the sarin gas that were used to attack Vietnamese civilians. They were applied against Vietnamese civilians, direct murder and mass murder by machine guns against the civilian population, forced relocation, which included bombing of villages, burning down of villages, napalming of villages, burning people's skin, all sorts of things. This, made World War II look, like a gentleman's war. The racist American whites refused to accept their responsibility for this war and criminal, murderous campaign for which they should have been prosecuted. Their presidents, Kissinger, Nixon, Kissinger, Johnson, McNamara, Rusk, Kennedy, Eisenhower, and Dulles should have been prosecuted and hanged for their crimes against the Indochinese people. But because America is a criminal mafia, gangster state of white murderous butchers, they walked free because the white man in America walks free for murderous butchery against any person who's not white. So that is the story. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just, read for 45 pages. And then at the end of the 45 pages, I'll give you a review, and then we'll be done. Please download the book. I always have my Google Books in the link in the description section of the video. Please download the book and read it. You won't get the best review of this war, and it's a very important book. It's called The Political Economy of Human Rights, which is the U.S. is human murderers. The U.S. is human murderers. So because it's the political economy of human rights, you should read the book. It includes all of the the different techniques for mass murder by the U.S. government and what they did to try to avoid development among the Indochinese people, a racist group of white murderous mafia, gangsters, mafia, butcher, mass murderers of genocidal proportion. So let's get started. We begin with Khampay Boupha, the Lao foreign minister who reacted to Jimmy Carter's denial of aid to Laos and the racist humanitarians of the U.S. government like Carter, who elicits suspicion among the Laotians for a U.S. human rights crusade. Mr. Boupha notes the U.S. Congress, racist, murderous butchers, opposition to American aid to Laos, including direct and indirect aid, during his meeting with Frederick of the U.S. State Department, questioned American commitment to human rights. He notes 3 million tons of bombs, white phosphorus, mustard gas, sarin, vomiting gases that killed and maimed hundreds and thousands of people and forced the people to abandon the fields. Unexploded ordinance was another aggressive criminal act by the U.S. mafia gangsters. He stated quite accurately that U.S. humanitarian concerns by refusing to help heal the wounds of war is not a humanitarian gesture, but in my view is more of a mafia gesture of murderous warmonger white butchers. Henry Kam of the New York Times published a fraudulent story on Mio villages being attacked in Laos, who bombed and genocided the Hmong and clandestine army, and Mio that CIA had contracts with. The abysmal record of U.S. journalism in Laos is described as fabrication and omitting the American hand, even if a long tradition of U.S. state terrorism and violence prevail. Times readers will not read it, though an expose may come years removed when the mafia's American dirty work is long finished and the CIA is reformed in keeping with American justice, democracy, and freedom for white fabrication. Kam does not describe the U.S. commitment to the Mio, who they had contracted and trapped them like desperate dogs in throwing away their leash when they lost their usefulness. The U.S. gun-violent backstab assassins of third world oppression approach to just wars and rules of war, throw away the colored third world allies when no longer useful and resort back to American racism. We also discussed an article in the New York Times by Henry Kam on March 21st, 1977, on Father Jelinas, who epitomized American rumor journalism and statistical guesswork as gospel when he reported 20,000 mass suicides in Vietnam under the communist regime as a way to describe communist tyranny. A further check was not done by the rumor propagators of American mafia journalism, and his number was reported repeatedly in the U.S. press as gospel. He derived at his number by a secondhand conversation of a nurse and a suicidee in a hospital that he had visited, and the nurse had indicated a mass suicide, and the new suicidee had attested to hundreds of bodies. He then took that number and multiplied it by a number of hospitals in Saigon and extrapolated a number of 20,000 suicides, which is white guesswork and numeric fraud. Secondhand information used by the U.S. press and rumor journalism of the New York Times allowed rumor about mass suicides in an attempt to draw sympathy from the Europeans, who are already racist and biased against the Vietnamese. This embodies the white fraud, racist U.S. government propaganda system. We also talk of the American academia frauds, Samuel Huntington, who reported from Harvard on the political correctness of the Vietnam War, and the descent of the war in the United States was because the U.S. government was not fascist enough and did not brutally murder or torture its citizens for contesting the war in principle. Again, another state rumor fraud, white academic proposing rumor of a crisis of democracy and begging for fascist response. Typical of the U.S. government, mafia, white warmonger, war criminal butchers. Lamont Parangot, a French racist, murderous, pro-colonialist fascist, made up lies about systematic recourse to repression, preventive arrest on simple suspicions, denunciation, and making informing on others a duty, and allowing all those who do not conform to the new model to stagnate in camps, aggravating their hatred and hopelessness. White gossip and fraud by the French Western racist press. He reported falsely and greatly exaggerated as a form of white gossip that non-communist activists who were courageously devoted to the defense of political prisoners under the former regime have become silent and spoke of full South Vietnamese prisons with torture, though not hideous like the U.S. Saigon regime. His statements of rumor are contraindicated by Toronto Globe and Mail. John Fraser, who spent 4 weeks and reported that the figure of 800,000 in prisons in South Vietnam is a fabrication since it reflects new economic zone relocations that are not in prison but are in the new economic zones allowing the Vietnamese regime to survive. Against the racist European mafia, white criminal gangsters of colonial fascism and enslavement provide fictional. Again, the racist European mafia, white criminal gangsters of colonial fascism and enslavement provide fictional numbers, statistical guesswork as gospel, and gross fabricated extrapolations of false numbers to present a picture of communist tyranny, a mark of a group of racist warmonger, white Western colonial fascist, murderous mafia gangsters. So let's get started. We're going to start on page 165, which is where we left off. I'm glad you could join us today. The right-wing Bangkok Post did not report the press conference in which Pin Thai presented his account of cannibalism and other horrors. The Bangkok Post story observed that Cambodian refugees in Thailand yesterday discounted reports that cannibalism is frequent in Cambodia and even doubted if it has occurred at all. It also quoted another Cambodian civil engineer who had long talks with Pin Thai while he was in Bangkok and who told AFP, no more than 40% of the statement Pin Thai made in the United States is true. He never went so far while talking to fellow refugees in his own language. The information was not circulated by accuracy in media in his attacks against the Washington Post, nor has it been presented by others who gave wide publicity to Pin Thai's accounts. That's regarding the made-up journalism of the Thai press about episodes of cannibalism within the Cambodian regime. Not all refugees are welcomed eagerly as Pin Thai. Consider, for example, the story in the London Times on a Vietnamese refugee who escaped from Vietnam through Cambodia to Thailand, which he entered in April 1976. He walked 350 miles through Cambodia over a 2-month period. A civil engineer with high qualifications who speaks French, Thai, Khmer, and Lao, in addition to English. This refugee, with his unique experience in post-war Cambodia, where because of his fluency in Khmer and local knowledge, he was taken everywhere for a Cambodian, seems a prime candidate for interviews with the press. But in fact, he never made it to the New York Times, Time, TV Guide, or other U.S. media. His lack of qualifications are revealed by his comments when he arrived in Thailand, where he heard stories of massacres in Cambodia. I could not believe it. Walking across the country for 2 months, I saw no sign of killing or mass extermination, and nobody I spoke to told me of it. I still don't believe it happened. Note that the observation of this man, middle-class refugee from Vietnam, with the appropriate anti-communist credentials, do not contradict the stories of brutal atrocities told in profusion by refugees. Rather, they are consistent with the remarks by State Department Cambodia watchers and other specialists on the geographical limitations of the worst atrocity stories, and suggest that there may be a good deal of local variation rather than the coordinated campaign of state-directed genocide and the media and their main sources prefer. But this very fact suffices to consign this report to oblivion in the United States, despite its undoubted significance as a rare window on inner Cambodia from what appears to be a fairly credible source. We will return to other examples, merely noting here the striking contrast between the media exposure in this case and the case of Pin Thai. In fact, even the witnesses who are specifically selected to recount atrocity stories often add significant qualifications. For example, one of the witnesses at the Oslo hearings on human rights violations in Cambodia, held in April 1978, was Lim Pek Kwan, who said that he well understood the Khmer Rouge policy. He asserted that he had never heard the Khmer Rouge indicate that they intended to kill all classes except the workers and poor peasants. It was perhaps more correct to say that in the Khmer Rouge interpretations, the relics of the classes would be abolished, not eradicated. He also said that he had never seen an execution with his own eyes. When he arrived in Phnom Penh after the Khmer Rouge victory, he had seen a number of corpses in the streets, but the corpses were covered, and so he could not see whether they were soldiers or civilians. He made it clear that it was the lack of freedom which made him flee by helicopter. While the media gave the impression that refugees have uniformly recounted stories of horrible atrocities, journalists have occasionally noticed that the reports are actually more varied. John Fraser of the Toronto Globe and Mail, whose reports from Vietnam we discussed briefly in Chapter 4, also visited a Cambodian refugee camp in Vietnam, fully prepared for a host of atrocity stories about mass executions, bloody beheadings, and savage Khmer Rouge brutality, particularly since the camp was only 15 miles from the border, where there had been deadly combat. To my surprise, I got lots of tales of hardship, but no atrocity save for a second-hand account of an execution of 2 men. The accounts of life in Cambodia were grim enough, and the atrocity stories too well authenticated to doubt, but still no one at the camp was able to tell me one. I finally had to ask if there was anyone who knew of an execution, and after some time, I got the second-hand story. I offer no conclusions on this singular fact, except that it was strange, and with so many refugees, not to be able to get more information, particularly since it would have been useful for Vietnamese propaganda. We know of only one Khmer-speaking Westerner who is an academic specialist on Cambodia who has visited refugee camps in Thailand without the supervision of authorities, namely Michael Vickeray, who reports as follows on his August 1976 visit. Since I speak Khmer, I was something of a curiosity for them, and it was easy to gather a crowd around and listen to what they said, whether in response to questions or to unorganized conversation. It was soon clear that there was much disagreement among the refugees about conditions in Cambodia. Some pushed the brutality line, others denied it or emphasized that killings were rare and due to the cruelty of a few individual leaders. Thus, many of the refugees admitted that they had left because they disliked the rigorous working life under the new regime, not because they were themselves threatened with death or brutality. So much, though, was already apparent from the close reading of newspaper accounts. What I found more intriguing was that at once, when alone with one of the men, he called attention to the lack of agreement and added that it was never noticed by outsiders because they didn't understand Khmer. According to him, camp authorities had organized French and English-speaking refugees as informants to give the official line to journalists who came to visit. We return to Vicky's published and private comments, which are valuable and very much to the point. Not everyone who is interested in analyzing refugee accounts is permitted the kind of access offered by the Thai Ministry of Interior to Barron and Cornell University Cambodian specialist Stephen Heder, who is a journalist in Phnom Penh, speaks and reads Khmer, is the author of articles on contemporary Cambodia, and has been notably skeptical about the standard conclusions drawn by journalists after guided tours through refugee camps, received funding from the Social Science Research Council and the Fulbright Hays program to do a systematic study of post-war Cambodia based on refugee testimony and Phnom Penh radio broadcasts. He was informed by the Secretary General of the National Research Council of Thailand and the present political situation in Thailand do not favor us to consider this type of research. Therefore, if you still have an intention to do research work in Thailand, please be advised to change your topic. One way to give the impression that refugee stories consistently and without exception report atrocities is to prevent competent researchers fluent in Khmer who do not need the guidance of Thai ministers or elected camp commanders from examining the evidence for themselves. We have no doubt that when Heder publishes on contemporary Cambodia, his work will be criticized by those who do not approve of his conclusions on the grounds that he ignores refugee data. To summarize, several points are worth noting. Refugee reports are to be taken seriously but with care. In the eagerness to obtain evidence that could be used to defame the regime in Cambodia, such reporters as Barron and Paul or Henry Kam, as their own testimony indicates, failed to observe the most objective and elementary cautions that should be second nature to any serious journalist and that are specifically emphasized by Panshaw, Twining, and others. The media, furthermore, have their own criteria for deciding which reports to emphasize and which to ignore. To evaluate refugee reports, it is necessary to take into account extreme bias both in selection of stories and treatment of them. The apparent uniformity of refugee testimony is in part at least an artifact reflecting media bias. In particular, it would be difficult to construct an argument in support of the thesis of central direction and planning of atrocities on the basis of alleged uniformity of refugee reports, since in fact there appears to be considerable variety to sustain such a thesis. Other evidence is required, for example, documentary evidence. The unwillingness of the Thai authorities to permit independent scholarly study also raises questions given the obvious interest of the Thai, shared by Western media and governments, in presenting the worst possible picture of post-war Cambodia. We will consider these questions in more detail below, but even a brief look at the handling of the refugee reports suggests that a degree of caution is in order. Refugee reports constitute one essential category of information about a society as close to the outside as post-war Cambodia has been. The second link in the chain of transmission of information, which in this case is subject to some independent check for credibility, is the reporters and others who transmit their stories. To inquire into their credibility is surely a crucial matter in evaluating the material that reaches the public. People who have expressed skepticism about the press barrage are commonly accused of refusing to believe the accounts of miserable refugees, a line that is much easier to peddle than the truth, that they are primarily raising questions about the credibility of those who report and perhaps exploit the suffering of the refugees and what they are alleged to have said. When refugee stories are transmitted by reporters of demonstrated integrity, they merit more serious attention than when the account is given by someone who is otherwise unknown or has an obvious axe to grind. When a reporter from Pravda describes the horrors of U.S. bombing of northern Laos, a rational observer will be more skeptical than when a similar eyewitness reports are provided by Jacques de Cournay in Lamond. Similarly, when Leo Schern, chairman of the International Rescue Committee, discusses the barbarism of the Khmer Rouge, a rational leader will recall the previous history of this longtime apologist for U.S. violence and oppression, who attempts to disguise this miserable display under a humanitarian cloak. For example, his supremely cynical description of the victims of U.S. bombings in South Vietnam. There are more than 700,000 traditional refugees who have recently fled the countryside dominated by the Viet Cong, and with their act of flight have chosen the meager sanctuary provided by the government of South Vietnam. To determine the credibility of those who transmit reports in a critical manner, for anyone concerned to discover the truth, either about Cambodia or about the current phase of imperial ideology, determine the credibility of those who transmit reports is a critical matter for anyone concerned to discover the truth, either about Cambodia or about the current phase of imperial ideology. There is only one way to investigate this question, namely to pay careful attention to the use of quotes and evidence. Such an inquiry may seem pointless or irrelevant or even cruel to people who are quite certain that they already know the truth. Lecoutre expresses feelings that are not uncommon in his quote-unquote corrections. Faced with an enterprise as monstrous as the new Cambodian government, we should see the main problem as one of deciding exactly which person uttered an inhumane phrase and whether the regime has murdered thousands or hundreds of thousands of wretched people, ? Is it of crucial importance to know whether the victims of Dachau numbered 100,000 or 500,000, or if Stalin had 1,000 or 10,000 Poles shot at Katyn? Or perhaps we may add whether the victims of My Lai numbered in the hundreds as reported, or tens of thousands, or whether the civilians murdered in Operation Speedy Express numbered 5,000 or 500,000, if a factor of 100 is relatively insignificant, ? If facts are so unimportant, then why bother to present alleged facts at all, ? If indeed the Cambodian regime was, as Lecoutre believes, as monstrous as the Nazis at the worst, that his comment might be comprehensible, though it is worth noting that he has produced no evidence to support this judgment. But if a more appropriate comparison is to say to France after liberation, where a minimum of 30 to 40,000 people were massacred within a few months with a far less motive for revenge and under far less rigorous conditions than those left by the U.S. war in Cambodia, then perhaps a rather different judgment is in order. As we shall see, there is a considerable range of opinion on this score among the qualified observers. When the press has favored Lecountre's conclusion, although the press has favored Lecountre's conclusion, generally ignoring mere questions of facts. Let me read that sentence again. As we shall see, there is considerable range of opinion on this score among qualified observers, though the press has favored Lecountre's conclusion, generally ignoring mere questions of fact. We disagree with Lecountre's judgment on the importance of accuracy on this question, particularly in the present historical context, when allegations of genocide are being used to whitewash Western imperialism, to distract attention from the institutionalized violence of the expanding system of sub-fascism, and to lay the ideologic basis for further intervention and oppression. We have seen how effectively the Western propaganda system creates, embroiders, plays up, distorts, and suppresses evidence according to imperial and colonial needs. Western dominations of world communications adds to the importance of closely evaluating evidence that so conveniently meets pressing ideologic requirements. In this context, it becomes a question of some interest whether in Cambodia, for example, a gang of Marxist murderers are systematically engaged in what Lecoutre calls auto-genocide, the suicide of a people in the name of revolution, worse, in the name of socialism, or whether the worst atrocities have taken place at the hands of a peasant army recruited and driven out of their devastated villages by the U.S. bombs and then taking revenge against urban civilization that they regarded, not without reason, as a collaborator of their destruction and their long history of oppression. Future victims of imperial savagery will not thank us for assisting in the campaign to restore the public to apathy and conformism so that the subjugation of the weak can continue without any domestic impediments, especially in such countries of France and the United States, to mention only two international gangsters who post-World War II depredations are not dismissed so quickly, be past and potential victims as they are at home. It is a crucially important matter to be quite scrupulous with regard to fact, to pay careful attention to past history, and to subject to critical analysis whatever information is available about the current situation. Attention to fact was a particularly significant matter under the conditions of 1975 to 1978, when extreme and unsupported allegations could be used to support military intervention. Not a small consideration, as we see from McGovern's statement already discussed, or more significantly, as recent history shows, from the context of the Vietnamese invasions discussed in the preface to this volume. Quite apart from these considerations, which seems to us rather important, it is surely worthwhile, if one is going to discuss Cambodia at all, to try to comprehend what has in fact taken place there, which is quite impossible if critical standards are abandoned and, quote, facts are contrived, even out of honest anger or distress. To inquire, the inquiry to which we now turn will appear to be a pointless exegetical exercise to people who share Lecoutre's judgment or whom the facts are simply an irrelevant nuisance. Like the editors of the Wall Street Journal, while the latter reaction merits no comment, Lecoutre's is not so quickly dismissed. Though we feel it is deeply wrong in the case of an investigation of post-war Cambodia and entirely untenable if one is concerned, as we are here with the workings of the Western propaganda system. There is a related methodologic point that merits comment, if only because it is so commonly misunderstood. Plainly, we may divide the evidence available into two categories: evidence subject to some independent verification, evidence that must be taken on faith. A person who is at all serious will concentrate on category one in trying to determine how much trust to place in unverifiable reports of category two. If it turns out that some source is quite untrustworthy when claims can be checked, then naturally one will view with corresponding skepticism reports from this source that are subject to no such check. But in these sources that raise the charge of genocide, The overwhelming bulk of the evidence is of category 2. Therefore, it is easy to be misled into thinking that even if the evidence of category 1 does not withstand critical analysis, the matter is of no serious import, since it is of such matter that nature, as minor nature, as compared with the far more serious and unverifiable charges. A moment's thought should suffice to show that this conclusion is entirely untenable. Nevertheless, as we shall see, is not at all uncommon. Let us return to McGovern's call for intervention and press reaction to it. McGovern provided no source for his takeover, his estimate of 2 to 2.5 million systematically killed by thugs who had taken over the government of Cambodia. Though such charges have been bandied about widely in the press since immediately after the Khmer Rouge victory, nor did McGovern attempt to sort out the relative proportions of those who were killed by government plan or edict or in random acts of violence, evidently rather different categories as compared with those who died from malnutrition and disease. McGovern's remarks, as well as much of the press commentary concerning them, amounts to the claim that the population is suffering in misery under a savage oppressor bent on genocide. Mere common sense, even apart from special knowledge, should raise at least some doubts about this picture. In the first place, it is proper to attribute deaths from malnutrition and disease to the Is it possible to attribute deaths from malnutrition and disease to the Cambodian authorities? Compare, for example, the case of Laos already discussed, where relief workers speak of hundreds of thousands of deaths from malnutrition and disease as a legacy of colonialism, and more specifically, the U.S. attack on a defenseless society, while the United States withholds desperately needed aid. It surely should occur to a journalist or the reader to ask how many of the deaths in Cambodia fall to the U.S. account. There is evidence on this matter, but it is systematically excluded from the press. Or one might wonder, how can it be that a population so oppressed by a handful of fanatics does not rise up to overthrow them? In fact, even the hearings where McGovern repeated the estimates of 2.5 million deaths attributed to the Khmer Rouge and called for international military intervention, the State Department response should have aroused some questions in the mind of moderately serious reporter. Douglas Pike, responding to McGovern, said that the notion of a quick surgical takeout of the government of Cambodia probably is not possible. He pointed to Cambodia's unique government consisting of a ruling group of 9 men at the center and communal government in the style of the 14th century in the villages, with no regional or provincial governments in between. To take over Cambodia, you're going to have to take over the villages, all of them, he said. Evidently, there must be at least some support for the group of 9 men. At the center of it will be necessary to take over every village to overthrow their rule. The quandary has been expressed by other State Department experts. Charles Twining, who says that he was sent to Bangkok by the State Department as the Indochina watcher, with responsibility primarily for finding out what is happening in Cambodia and Vietnam, made the following remark in response to Representative Solar's query as to how people at the top managed to establish their authority over these young soldiers out in the villages who are carrying out this policy of extermination. It is a difficult question. We know the levels of administration in Cambodia. It goes from the central to the region, to the sector, to the district, of the commune, to the village. Presumably, then, there are loyal people at all these levels. What really binds together these largely Paris-educated fanatics at the top with almost purposely ignorant farm boys at the bottom, who are the ones with the guns carrying out their orders? I really don't know what it is that keeps them together, and I wonder in the future how long something like this can continue, how long that glue can hold. It is indeed a difficult question. And similar doubts were raised by experts close to the U.S. government during the earlier May hearings in response to Representative Solar's remarks about possible intervention. Peter A. Poole, formerly a foreign service officer in Cambodia and now a professor of international Relations at American University, said that I think that an international police force would be one of the worst possible things we can do. On the evacuation of Phnom Penh, he said, they obviously overdid it. They obviously did it very badly. But the general thrust of moving people out of the city was something that practically any regime would have contemplated and done at some stage in that year, getting the people back on the land and producing rice. The Khmer Rouge, he added, took over at a time when society was in ruins, so that there was no normal means of government, in a state of social, political, and economic chaos, and ran the country with an ignorant peasant teenage army, a rather large, very obedient army, well armed and totally flexible, totally obedient to orders, who might respond to a command to march the people down the road by shooting those who do not obey. As to how the Khmer Rouge were able to establish that sense of total discipline in the ranks of the army, Poole answered, I don't know the answer to that question. Another former Foreign Services officer in Phnom Penh, David Chandler, now a senior lecturer at Monash University in Australia, added some further comments which had little impact on the subsequent proceedings. What drove the Cambodians to kill, ? Paying off old scores or imaginary ones played a part, but to a large extent, I think, American actions are to blame. From 1969 to 1973, after all, we dropped more than 500,000 tons of bombs on the Cambodian countryside. Nearly half of this tonnage fell in 1973. In those few months, we may have driven thousands of people out of their minds. We certainly accelerated the course of the revolution. According to several accounts, the leadership hardened its ideology and got rid of wavering factions during 1973 and 1974. We bombed Cambodia without knowing why, without taking note of the people we destroyed. It is ironic to use a colorless word for us to accuse the Cambodians of being indifferent to life when, for so many years, Cambodian lives made so little difference to us. Chandler's comment was rejected by Representative William Goodling on the following grounds. Our bombs didn't single out certain segments of certain peoples in Cambodia. Our bombs hit them all, and whether you thought it was right or I thought it was right, the military at that particular time thought it was right. The command is a fitting one from a leading apologist for the U.S.-backed Indonesian atrocities in Timor. Twinning's difficult question is addressed in an article by Kenneth Quinn of the National Security Council staff, one of the three leading U.S. government experts in Cambodia, basing himself primarily on refugees who fled Cambodia in 1973 to 1974. Quinn reviews Khmer Rouge programs in an effort to explain how small a dedicated force was able to impose a revolution on a society without widespread participation of the peasantry, and indeed in the face of strong peasant opposition. He does not remark that since his evidence derives primarily from the in-depth interviewing of selected refugees, it will obviously be negative. Those who might approve of these programs are excluded from his example. But ignoring this trivial point, Quinn states that the evidence overwhelmingly demonstrates that the peasantry was opposed to almost all of the Khmer Rouge programs. Quinn discusses programs which included land reform, establishment of cooperatives, ensuring that all citizens have roughly the same degree of wealth, obliterating class lines by confiscating property from the wealthy and compelling university students to plant and harvest rice, distributing excess crops to feed other groups whose harvest was insufficient, etc. He notes that as a result of collectivization, production has outstripped previous individual efforts, that the political, psychological Khmer Rouge efforts seem to have achieved significant results, according to all accounts among the youth who are passionate in their loyalty to the state and party, rejected the mystical aspects of religion, and stopped working on their family plot of land and instead worked directly for the Youth Association on its land. He also comments that the Khmer Rouge success is all the more amazing when it is realized that they had few, if any, cadres in the village or hamlet level. In most cases, there was no separate party existence, nor were there political cadres at the village level or at any level below, though there were a small, apparently locally recruited military units in the midst of the Civil War, as well as interfamily groups of a sort that have existed in other Southeast Asian countries for years and were used by the Khmer Rouge for forcing the population to carry out a series of radically new programs. Quinn then asked the difficult question: how did such a small group of people carry out such a varied and all-encompassing effort? His answer is that they cowed people and suppressed dissent and opposition through harsh and brutal punishments, and they constructed a governmental apparatus at the villages and hamlet level, which allowed them to exercise tight control over every family in the area. The possibility that some of the programs he reviewed might appeal to poor peasants is nowhere considered. It is excluded on doctrinal grounds. Quinn claims that in 1973, the Khmer Rouge programs became extremely harsh as new cadres took over, described as fanatics who were austere and did not take anything for themselves and seemed willing to live a frugal life, but instituted widespread terror. Other sources, as we have seen, confirm that the Khmer Rouge programs became harsh in 1973 as the United States stepped up its murderous program of saturation bombing, possible causal factor that Quinn is careful never to mention. There are other aspects of the difficult question that properly troubled government specialists. Indeed, how do the Khmer Rouge manage to maintain control? Question mark. Here, the refugee reports evoke some questions. For example, R.P. Paranga reported interviews with two high functionaries of the Law Null regime who had escaped to Thailand. They report that armed surveillance was almost non-existent in the village to which they were sent. In case there are problems, the village chief can call upon a militia group of 12 Khmer Rouges who maintain order in the 10 villages of the sector. One of these functionaries comments that the old people who are with the Khmer Rouge during the war offer more support to the new regime. They are peasants who have always been used to hard work and to be content with little. It would seem not unlikely that part of the answer to this difficult question and a reason why a dozen militiamen can maintain order in 10 villages is that the regime has a modicum of support among the peasants. Other questions arise if 1/3 of the population has been killed by a murderous band that has taken over the government, which somehow manages to control every village, or have died as a result of their genocidal policies, then surely one would expect if not a rebellion, then at least unwillingness to fight for the Paris-educated fanatics at the top. But the confused and obscure record of the border conflict with Thailand and Vietnam would appear to indicate that there are a substantial number of purposefully ignorant farm boys who have not exactly been awaiting liberation from their oppressors. As Pike observed in response to McGovern's call for intervention, the Vietnamese tried a quick judo chop against the Cambodian regime with 60,000 troops, but failed abysmally. Basing herself on Pike's testimony, Susan Spencer of CBS raised the question to McGovern in an TV interview. When McGovern referred to Cambodia as an undeveloped country that has gotten out of control and is systematically slaughtering its own citizens, Spencer makes the following comment. You mentioned that we should apply pressure. It seems, though, that the Vietnamese, who periodically are at war with Cambodia, have found that Cambodian citizens, at least the villagers, seem to support the government. What lever do we have to break that? Spencer's question is a bit odd to begin with. If the villagers of the largely peasant society support the government, as Spencer assumes, then at exactly what right do we have to find a lever to break that? Question mark. And how does that alleged support square with the charge of genocide? Question mark. These questions did not arise. However, McGovern simply replied that the evidence is that about 9 men are controlling that government in Cambodia without a loyal infrastructure out across the country. It is hard to believe that there's a mass support for the Cambodian government. The problem is implicit, though rarely discussed in these terms. In other reports concerning Cambodia, Robert Chaplin, who has been the Far Eastern correspondent for The New Yorker for many years, observes that in the border war with Vietnam, the Cambodians have proved to be tough, ruthless, and relentless fighters. The Southeast Asia correspondent for the Christian Science Monitor comments that despite Vietnamese superior size, economy, and military power, Cambodia appears to have emerged in the technical victor after the Vietnamese invasion that ended with a military withdrawal in January. In fact, Cambodian attacks across Vietnam's border currently are described by one analyst as heavier than ever. Vietnam appears to have underestimated the strength of Cambodian resistance, several analysts note. The continuing conflict with Thailand brings out similar anomalies. Whatever the facts may be, and they are far from clear, it seems that Cambodian forces held their own, so much so that the U.S. analysts voiced skepticism about Hanoi's ability to crush Cambodia, despite its overwhelming military advantages, because of factors such as the apparently excellent morale of the Cambodian ground forces. Various explanations have been offered for these facts, which at the very least, raise questions about allegations that the population is groaning under the heels of the conqueror. William Buckley explains the difficulty away with resort to the mysterious Asian mind. Nationalism carried to such lengths is utterly alien to the Western experience. Panchard argues that the old Hindu core, which regarded authority as a divine incarnation, was still strong in the Khmers. The Cambodian sticks to the rule. The Khmer people still respect authority with a respect that to us is tinged with fatalism, even passivity, but that emanates an underlying confidence of the abilities of those in power. The underlying ideology of the revolution may come from somewhere else, but the methods employed show every mark of the Cambodian character, and Khmer culture makes it possible for the authorities to rule the countryside with terror and lies. Though under Marxist influence, perhaps the Khmer will suddenly open a critical eye. Another cause of the radicality of the Khmer revolution lies in the Khmer way of reasoning, which is bewildering to the Cartesian minds. The Khmer thinks by accretions or juxtapositions, but adheres strictly to the rules of his own internal logic, apparently incapable of Cartesian logic. The non-specialist might wonder about the contingency of these explanations, or of the difficult question that the government specialists rightly find troubling. It is noteworthy that in the varied attempts to find a solution to this most difficult question, one conceivable hypothesis does not seem to have been considered, even to be rejected, and that there was a significant degree of peasant support for the Khmer Rouge and the measures they had instituted in the countryside. As we begin to inquire a little further, other difficult questions arise. Consider the numbers game. What is the source of the figures invoked by the press? We shall see that the sources are obscure or misrepresentative. Though when corrected, they continue to surface. Furthermore, there is considerably more controversy among knowledgeable observers that the standard line of the press would indicate. For example, Louis Simmons, the outstanding Washington Post correspondent, reported from Bangkok that disease and malnutrition combined with a dropping birth rate are taking a greater toll of Cambodia's population than communist executions, according to some of the latest analysis made here. There is a major reversal in Western judgments of what had gone on inside democratic Kampuchea. Most Westerners who make an occupation of observing Cambodia from Thailand are talking on terms of several 100,000 deaths from all causes. This is a marked shift from the estimates of just 6 months ago, when it was popular to say that anywhere between 800,000 and 1.4 million Cambodians had been executed by vengeful communist rulers. He also noted that few Cambodia watchers believe that the organization is organized well enough to control much of the country. It is generally accepted that local military commanders operating from jungle bases conduct their own small-scale murder rations and impose summary justice. There are two noteworthy points in this report by Louis Simmons, which was accepted with one irrelevant qualification as excellent by the State Department's leading Cambodia watcher. First, the number of deaths is estimated by most Westerners who are close observers as in the several 100,000 range, most of them from disease and malnutrition. Second, most Cambodia watchers doubt that the summary justice is centrally organized, believing rather that it is the responsibility of local commanders Again, we are left with some doubts, to put it conservatively, as regards to the standard media picture, a centrally controlled genocide policy of mass executions. Note also that the numbers killed were estimated by the leading government expert as in the thousands of hundreds of thousands. Twining, who adds that very honestly, I think we can't accurately estimate a figure. His superior, Richard Holbrook, offered an estimate of tens, if not hundreds of thousands, for deaths from all causes. He offered his guess that for every person executed, several people have died of disease, malnutrition, or other factors, while he claimed which he claims were avoidable, though he does not indicate how. Twinning's colleague Timothy Carney, who the second of the State Department's leading Cambodia watchers, estimated the number of deaths from brutal, rapid change, not mass genocide, as in the hundreds of thousands. What about deaths from causes other than killing? A major source of death, Simmons reported, appears to be failure of the 1976 rice crop. The government averted famine in mid-1975 by evacuating Phnom Penh and other cities and forcing about almost every able-bodied person to work the land, but food production fell badly last year. If this excellent analysis is correct, as Twinning indicates, the evacuation of Phnom Penh, widely denounced at the time and since for its undoubted brutality, may actually have saved many lives. It is striking that the crucial facts rarely appear in the chorus of condemnations. At the time of the evacuation, AFP reported from Bangkok that recent aerial photographs by American reconnaissance planes are said to have shown that only 12% of the rice paddies have been planted. The monsoon, which marks the beginning of the planting season, came a month early this year. There was also the problem of the acute shortage of rice in the capital when the communists took over on April 17th. According to Long Boret, the old government's last premier, Phnom Penh had only 8 days' worth of rice on hand on the eve of the surrender. In the New York Times op-ed, William Goodfellow, who left Cambodia with the final U.S. evacuation in April 1975, wrote that AID officials reported that stockpiles of rice in Phnom Penh could last for 6 days, commenting on the death march from Phnom Penh. He writes that, in fact, it was a journey away from certain death and starvation, was already a reality in urban centers. The director of the U.S. aid program estimated that in Phnom Penh alone, 1.2 million people were in desperate need of United States food, although at the time only 640,000 people were actually receiving some form of United States food support, and starvation was widely reported. Goodfellow also correctly assigns the responsibility for the impending famine. It was caused primarily by the U.S. bombing campaign, which shattered the agrarian economy, an unquestionable fact that has since been quietly forgotten. The situation in Phnom Penh resulting from the U.S. war is graphically described in a carefully documented study by Hildebrand and Porter that has been almost totally ignored by the press. By early 1974, the World Health Organization estimated that half the children of Phnom Penh, which was swollen to almost 5 times its normal size by the U.S. bombardment and the ravages of the war directly caused by U.S. intervention, were suffering from malnutrition. A congressional study mission reported severe nutritional damages. Studies in late 1974 and early 1975 revealed a disastrous decline in nutritional status, indicating a caloric intake during a year or longer of less than 60% of the minimum required to maintain body weight. A Department of State study of February 1975 reported that these statistics confirm the universal medical impression given by us, those involved in Cambodian health and nutrition, that children are starving to death. Starvation has also lowered resistance to infection and disease. There were reports that cholera was spreading rapidly in Phnom Penh. The medical director for the Catholic Relief Services declared in March 1975 that hundreds are dying from malnutrition every day. Red Cross and other observers reported thousands of small children dying from hunger and disease. Not all of this refers to the period before the Khmer Rouge victory. As Hildebrand and Porter remarked, those children who did not die from starvation will suffer permanent damage to their bodies and minds due to the severe malnutrition. They quote Dr. Penelope Key of the World Vision Organization working in Phnom Penh. The generation is going to be a lost generation of children. Malnutrition is going to affect their numbers and their mental capacities. So, as well as knocking off a generation of young men, the war is knocking off a generation of children. Porter added relevant information in his congressional testimony. It must be noted that the same official forces who were claiming a post-war death toll of 800,000 to 1.4 million had been saying in June 1975 that 1 million people were certain to die of starvation in the next year because there were simply no food stocks available in Cambodia to provide for them. Porter drew the conclusion that the post-war death tolls were exaggerated by officials who had an obvious vested interest, not admitting their failure to understand the capacity of the new regime to feed its people. Alternatively, suppose that the post-war estimates are correct, since the situation at the war's end is squarely the responsibility of the United States. So are the million or so deaths that were predicted as a direct result of that situation. The horrendous situation in Phnom Penh, as elsewhere in Cambodia, as the war drew to an end, was a direct and immediate consequence of the U.S. assault. Prior to the United States actions that drew Cambodia into the Indochina War, the situation was far from ideal, contrary to the colonialist myths about happy peasants, but it was nothing like the accounts just reviewed by congressional study missions and health and relief workers. The same is true of the vast destruction of agricultural lands and drought animals, peasant villages, and communications, not to speak of the legacy of hatred and revenge. The United States bears primary responsibility for these consequences of its intervention. All of this is forgotten when sole responsibility is assigned to the Khmer Rouge for deaths from malnutrition and disease. It is as if some Nazi apologists were to condemn the Allies for post-war deaths from starvation and disease in DP camps, though the analogy is unfair to the Nazis, since the Allies at least had the resources to try to deal with the Nazi legacy. Consider again what lies behind the call for military intervention in Cambodia. The leading State Department specialist estimated killings in the thousands or hundreds of thousands and attributed a still large number of deaths to disease and malnutrition, in significant and perhaps overwhelming measure, a consequence of United States terror. Furthermore, a news report that the State Department specialist regards as excellent notes that it is generally accepted by Cambodia watchers that summary justice is not centrally directed. Another government expert insists that it would be necessary to conquer every village to subdue the Khmer Rouge. But when a leading senatorial dove calls for military intervention, the Wall Street Journal, which backed the U.S. aggression and massive massacre through the worst atrocities, has the gall to make the following editorial comment. Now, having finished the task of destroying the U.S. presence in Indochina, American liberals are shocked and dismayed by the news of the grim and brutal world that resulted. One of the few good things to come out of the sordid end of our Indochina campaign was a period of relative silence from the people who took us through all its painful contortions. They should have the grace to maintain their quiet for at least a while longer. About post-war Cambodia, they have only this to say. The present communist rulers have starved, worked, shot, beaten, and hacked to death upwards of 1 million of the country's citizens. Not a word about the U.S. role or continuing responsibility for death and suffering, let alone an effort to evaluate the evidence or to face the difficult questions that arise. It would take a volume to record the material of this sort that dominates the U.S., indeed the Western press, before turning to the nature of the evidence adduced concerning the scale and character of post-war atrocities in Cambodia. We will cite only one more example selected out of the mass of comparable instances, along with an example of journalistic integrity that is another of the rare exceptions. On July 31st, 1978, Time magazine published a Time essay entitled Cambodia, an Experiment in Genocide by David Aikman. The essay is short on documentation, but not sparing in its outrage. The sole documentation offered is the interview with Q Sampan, already cited, an example that was specifically pointed out in advance to a Time reporter preparing background for this article as a probable fabrication, and a statement on Radio Phnom Penh that more than 2,000 years of Cambodian history has virtually ended, which Aikman presented as a boast of this atrocity, though only other interpretations easily come to mind. According to Time, the lowest estimate of the bloodbath to date by execution, starvation, and disease is in the hundreds of thousands. The highest exceeds 1 million, and that in a country that once numbered no more than 7 million. Figures apart, what is striking about this claim is that nowhere in the article is there any reference to any U.S. role or responsibility, no indication that the deaths from starvation and disease may be something other than a bloodbath by the Khmer Rouge. A major theme of the Time essay is that somehow the enormity of the Cambodian tragedy, even leaving aside the grim question of how many or how few actually died in Anga Lu's experiment in genocide, has failed to evoke an appropriate response of outrage in the West. And even worse, some political theorists have defended it, as George Bernard Shaw and other Western intellectuals defended the brutal social engineering of the Soviet Union during the 1930s. There are intellectuals in the West so committed to the twin Molochs of our day, liberation and revolution, that they can actually defend what has happened in Cambodia. In fact, the Western press since 1975 has poured forth reams of denunciations of Cambodia in the most strident tones, repeating the most extreme denunciations, often on flimsy evidence, in striking contrast to its behavior in the case of massacres elsewhere, as in Timor. The U.S. press is particularly notable for a marked double standard in this regard, though it is hardly alone. And there is good reason why Aikman fails to mention the names of those political theorists who have defended the Cambodian tragedy, as this would require differentiating those who have exposed media distortions and tried to discover the facts, instead of joining the bandwagon of uncritical abuse from those who say that no serious atrocities have occurred. A small or non-existent set of Time has searched for, apparently without success. Specificity also might require publicizing the views of critics of the current propaganda barrage, which would make it difficult to avoid discussions of the crucial U.S. role in post-war suffering and deaths in Cambodia, or of the actual nature of what Time regards as evidence. For Time ideologists, a defender of the Cambodian tragedy is one who fails to place all the blame for post-war suffering on the Khmer Rouge, and who otherwise contests the patriotic truths handed out by the Reader's Digest or similar sources. For the ideologists of Time, the Cambodian tragedy is the logical conclusion of bloodbath sociology associated with socialism and Marxism. The moral relativism of the West makes it difficult to see the Cambodian experience is the deadly logical consequence of an atheistic, man-centered system of values enforced by fallible human beings with total power who believe, with Marx, that morality is whatever the powerful define it to be, and with Mao, that power is from the gun barrel. Unlike the more humane Marxist societies in Europe today, the Cambodians do not permit the dilution of their doctrine by what Solzhenitsyn has called the great reserves of mercy and sacrifice from a Christian tradition. As for the significance of the Christian tradition for the Third World, not to speak of the European experience, Time has no more to say than about the great reserves of mercy and sacrifice showed by the U.S. leaders who sent their angels of mercy to flatten the villages of Indochina, while the editors of Time lauded the noble enterprise. And it is fitting indeed that they should cite Solzhenitsyn, the profound thinker who denounced the West for failing to carry out this enterprise to a successful conclusion in the spirit of Christian humanism. To show, in contrast, that honest journalism remains possible, consider a report by Richard Dudman just after the fall of Phnom Penh. Dudman was captured in Cambodia while serving as a U.S. war correspondent in Southeast Asia and wrote an important book on his experience with the Khmer Rouge. Dudman writes that the constant indiscriminate bombing, an estimated 450,000 dead and wounded civilians, to say nothing of military casualties, and the estimated 4 million refugees were almost inevitable results of the short U.S. invasion of Cambodia and the subsequent proxy war that ended in the defeat for the United States, as well as for its client regime in Phnom Penh. Relying in part on his personal experience in captivity, he adds that the U.S. invasion spread the communist-led guerrillas through most of Cambodia and drove the Vietnamese communists and the Cambodian population into alliance as comrades in arms against a common enemy, American tanks and bombs, which were a catalyst. We, the Khmer Rouge prisoners, could see the Cambodian peasants turning to a friend in need in the form of military forces of the Vietnamese communists. To ignore these basic facts in reporting post-war Cambodia is as disgraceful as to attribute the U.S. legacy of starvation, disease, and bitter hatreds simply to atheistic communism carried out to its logical conclusion. Let us now turn to an evaluation of the evidence that is used by the media as support for their denunciations. Simons examined this question in an analysis after his return from several years as post correspondent in Bangkok. Accompanying the article is a photograph showing workers under military guard with the following caption: "Photo from smuggled film purports to show forced labor in Cambodian countryside." Simmons comments that a number of journals, including the Washington Post, Newsweek, Time, and Paris Match, have published several photographs purporting to show atrocities in Cambodia. But he continues. Several U.S. and other experts believe that these pictures were posed in Thailand. They're fakes, commented the State Department officer who has followed Cambodian affairs closely since before the end of the war. As we shall see, there is more to the story. The photographs continued to be published long after they were exposed as frauds, and correction were refused by the journals that published them. Simons next turns to the interview in which Q Sampan is alleged to have conceded that the Khmer Rouge are responsible for 1 million deaths, which he writes was subsequently referred to in the New York Times Magazine. He adds that the very occurrence of that interview is denied by Francois Panchard. Again, we see there is more to the story. Simons then makes the following interesting observation. Oddly, those few Western governments which have diplomatic relations with Cambodia generally refuse to accept the genocide allegations. We need a lot more evidence before we'd be ready to believe such a serious charge, said an ambassador from a Scandinavian country. Representatives of his government have visited Phnom Penh several times since the war ended. This lead, too, deserves to be explored. It is indeed odd that Western visitors to Phnom Penh refuse to join the chorus. At the very least, a rational person might well heed Simon's observation that reports about Cambodia should be treated with skepticism. Simons offers other reasons for skepticism, noting that just one member of the U.S. Embassy staff in Thailand, presumably Twining, is assigned to monitoring the Cambodian affairs. Simons comments, more information gathered by this official and by journalists in Southeast Asia comes from interviewing Cambodian refugees who have fled to Thailand. Almost all of these refugees come from the northwestern part of Cambodia, an area which was never well controlled by the communists and where reprisals by long embittered guerrillas were fierce in the months immediately following the communist victory. From this bare-bones intelligence gathering, nationwide projections have been drawn. It is these projections that have led to the conclusion that Cambodian leaders are genocidal monsters and that the torment of this once gentle land has no parallel in modern history. Again, what Simons reports has been emphasized by specialists to whom we return. The State Department's Cambodian watcher, Charles Twining, comments that our information is just inadequate. Most of it is from northwestern Cambodia, and we have virtually nothing from northeastern Cambodia. So it is awfully hard to put together a significant figure, and I think none of us want to give an estimate of deaths. Simon cites Gareth Porter's comment that the forced evacuation of urban centers was well advised, though heavy-handed. He quotes Porter as follows: "The fact is that the evacuation and the regime's concentration of rice production have averted mass starvation." If you look at the three Indo-Chinese countries today, you'll find that Cambodia is undoubtedly in the best food position. Simons continues, the claim is more or less supported by State Department officials who said people are probably eating better and note reports of rice exports. We will return to reports by visitors that confirm these conclusions, contrary to the standard picture presented by the media of mass starvation or even systematic policies of starvation undertaken by the leadership as Lecoutre and others contend. It is particularly worthy of note that visitors in late 1978 found food supplies to be more than adequate. The severe floods of the preceding months had a devastating effect on agricultural production throughout the region, causing a very serious shortage of food in neighboring countries. Some reports indicate that Cambodia may have been the hardest hit of all the countries of the region. But it seems that the extensive development of dikes and dams in the post-war period, which has consistently impressed visitors, sufficed, despite some damage, to overcome the worst effects and to afford the population an ample supply of food, even including a surplus for export, according to the regime, an achievement that U.S. specialists describe as spectacular, if true. Simons takes note of the U.S. attack on Cambodia and gives an accurate account of doubts raised by critics of the Western propaganda system, whom he misleadingly describes as supporters of the Cambodian regime or defenders or friends of the regime. Concern for factual accuracy carries no such implications. He asks why the most extreme conclusions about Cambodia have been widely accepted despite their flimsy basis often, and suggests two reasons. First, while figures may be subjected to doubt, what's the difference between whether tens of thousands or 1 million people have been killed? Second, the refusal of the government to permit outside observers itself suggests that they are attempting to hide some horrible secret. Simons argues that these points have acceptable moral basis, but sidestep key issues. Reprisals have been common after other wars, and while the Cambodian government's policy towards foreigners may be judged extreme xenophobia, it does not prove that genocide is being carried out behind the bamboo curtain. We are more skeptical about the moral basis for these points, for reasons already discussed. We wonder, for example, whether the reaction would be the same if some critic of the United States were to charge that U.S. troops had killed 40,000 civilians at My Lai, then responding to a correction by asking what's the difference, just a factor of 100. Recall further that it is more sensational claims that have endlessly been repeated by the media and have led to a call for military intervention in Cambodia. As for Cambodian xenophobia, it is worth considering just what the experience of Cambodian peasants has been with the West, not only under French colonialism, but also in the few years of the war. Does the term xenophobia accurately convey their reaction? This report by one of the few serious U.S. correspondents who have recently worked in Southeast Asia stands alone in the U.S. mass media to our knowledge. In its fairness and accuracy in presenting the views of the critics of the media barrage and its concern for the quality of available evidence, though Simon's skepticism, like that of many other close observers, have been drowned in the deluge. Let us now consider in detail the several points that Simon raised. To begin with, consider the photographs that appeared along with Simon's article. This is one of several that have, as he knows, been widely circulated in the press as sure proof of communist barbarism. On April 8, 1977, the Washington Post devoted half a page to photographs believed to be the first of actual forced labor conditions in the countryside of Cambodia to have reached the West. The pictures show armed soldiers guarding people, pulling plows, others working fields, and one bound man. It is not known if this man was killed, the caption reads. Quite a sensational testimonial to communist atrocities. But there is a slight problem. The Post account of how they were smuggled out by a relative of the photographer who died in the escape attempt is entirely fanciful. Furthermore, the photos had appeared in a year after earlier in France, Germany, and Australia, as well in the Bangkok Post, where they appeared under the caption "True or False?" This strongly anti-communist journal turned down an attempt by a Thai trader to sell them the photos because the origin and authenticity of the photos were in doubt. The photos appeared in a Thai language newspaper 2 days before the April 4th election. The Bangkok Post then published them, explaining that Khmer watchers were dubious about the clothes and manners of the people depicted, and quoting other observers who pointed to the possibility that the series of pictures could have been taken in Thailand with the prime objective of destroying the image of the socialist parties before the election. This speculation seems eminently reasonable. Westerners in Southeast Asia have reported that the Thai press, including the Bangkok Post, was exploiting horror stories from Cambodia to undermine the socialist parties in Thailand. The facts were reported in the U.S. Indochina report in the Washington based Indochina Resource Center in July 1976, along with the additional information that a Thai intelligence officer later admitted that the photos were indeed posed inside Thailand. Only the photographer and I were supposed to know, he confided to a Thai journalist. The full details were again given in the International Bulletin Circulation 6000, a letter of April 20th to the Washington Post, correcting a story was not printed, though the Post published a short item acknowledging the doubts but pointing out that pictures had been published elsewhere. The freedom of the press assures that readers of the International Bulletin could learn the true facts of the matter concealed by the mass media. We reviewed the story thus far shortly thereafter, but it continued to evolve. The major news weeklies did not want to miss the opportunity to offer their readers visual evidence of the Khmer Rouge tyranny and not be deterred merely because the evidence was faked. Repeated exposure has rarely dimmed the luster of other familiar propaganda tales, such as the North Vietnamese land reform bloodbath of the 1950s, discussed in Volume 1. On November 21st, 1977, Time magazine ran the photo of the bound man, while the Washington Post had withheld judgment on whether the victim was killed in the stage photo. Doubts had now been eliminated, and Time assured the reader that he was executed. Several letters were sent to Time reporting the facts just reviewed and also noting that their fakery went beyond that of the Washington Post. Those who had wasted their efforts alerting Time to the facts were rewarded by the following response. Time printed the photograph of a Khmer Rouge execution, if indeed that is what it is, in good faith. We were assured by its authenticity by the Sigma agency who provided us with it. They say they obtained it from a Cambodian refugee now living in Paris, whose name did not appear in the credit for fear of endangering his family in Cambodia. We note that the authenticity of the photograph has been questioned, but it seems to us that there is no way of proving it one way or the other. However, we do thank you for alerting us to the problem. Not to be outdone, Newsweek leaped into the fray in its issue in January 28th, 1978. January 23rd, 1978. The executioner and his victim appear on the cover of an international edition, and two other faked photos appear within, one with the caption, "The executioners, for the condemned, a swift, primitive, and brutal death," and the other, "Life under the Khmer Rouge. Armed guards supervise forced labor in the fields." In a February 1978 story filed by the Pacific News Service, Douglas Foster added some further details. He cites a State Department intelligence source who labels the photos a fake and said in an interview that he was appalled and shocked to see the photographs in the press. Foster also interviewed the director of the Sigma agency, which had been distributing these intelligence fabrications to eager customers. She claims to have alerted Time to the possibility that the photos were propaganda plants, but held that the photographs were useful anyway, regardless of their authenticity, on the following grounds. As the people at Newsweek told me, if the photograph hasn't all been absolutely proved false, the questions don't matter. Besides that, the Khmer Rouge do these things, like blowing people's heads off, so the photos are like drawings. Foster notes that the photos have appeared widely in the U.S. and Western Europe and also in Australia, and comments no Western publisher who has used the photos has yet alerted readers to the pictures may well be bogus. The reaction of the Washington Post, Time, Newsweek, the Sigma agency, and others who have been engaged in this little exercise of atrocity fabrication recalls some of George Orwell's remarks on the Stalinist press. When one considers the elaborate forgeries that have been committed in order to show that Trotsky did not play a valuable part in the Russian Civil War, it is difficult to feel that the people responsible were merely lying. More probably, they feel that their own version was what happened in the sight of God, and that one is justified in rearranging the records accordingly. Putting aside the manifest dishonesty, suppose that the photographs had been authentic. We might then ask why people should be pulling plows in Cambodia as one of the fake photographs claims to show. The reason is clear, though unmentioned in this propaganda exercise. The savage U.S. assault on Cambodia did not spare the animal population. The Cambodian government reports that the attack on rural Cambodia led to the destruction of 50 to 60% of livestock in some areas, 30 to 40% in others. One can learn from the reports of refugees that they had to pull the plows themselves because there were no oxen. Some died from the exhausting work of pulling plows. Who is responsible for these deaths? The U.S. press did not have to resort to propaganda plans to depict the facts. A 100-word item buried in the New York Times cites an official UN report that teams of human buffaloes pull plows in Laos and areas where the buffalo herds, along with everything else, were decimated by U.S. bombing, although this goes unmentioned in the Times in accordance with post-war taboo. Much the same is true in Vietnam, as already noted. Quite possibly the UN or the Laotian government could supply photographic evidence, but this would not satisfy the needs of current propaganda. Let us now turn to the second example that Simmons cites, namely the interview in which Cambodian Premier Khu Sampan is alleged to have conceded 1 million deaths at the hands of the Khmer Rouge. This is the most widely circulated, crucial evidence offered of the barbarity of the regime. We have already given several examples and is regularly cited by academic specialists, intelligence analysts, and Cambodia watchers. Frank Snapp, one of the top CIA analysts for Indochina, writes the following with regard to the atrocities of the Khmer Rouge, which typically he claims have been ignored in the West. Khu Sampan himself has provided perhaps the most reliable estimate of the casualties during a conference of non-aligned countries in Colombo in August 1976. He admitted to an Italian journalist that the population of Cambodia had dropped by 1 million since the end of the war. When asked what had happened to these people, he replied, "It's incredible how concerned you Westerners are about war criminals." Similarly, Timothy Carney, a State Department specialist in Cambodia, testified before Congress without qualifications that in a 1976 interview with an Italian magazine, Khu Sampan said that there were 5 million people in Cambodia, given roughly 1 million killed or wounded during the war, a close estimate according to Carney, and a pre-war population on the order of 7 to 8 million. We have over 1 million post-war deaths, victims of the Khmer Rouge, with a further sleight of hand. As Carney notes, the alleged estimate of 5 million by Khu Sampan contradicts the estimate of the Cambodian government that the population is 7.7 million, but he offers no explanation for the discrepancy. Simons reports that the alleged interviews was supposedly given by head of state Khu Sampan to an obscure Italian Catholic journal, Famiglia Cristiana, in September 1976, and subsequently referred to in the New York Times magazine, though its authenticity is denied by Panchard, a French Roman Catholic priest who is a bitter opponent of the Cambodian communists, who wrote in August 1977 that he knows for certain that the interview never took place. The statements are correct, but are only part of the story. To add some further detail, in the New York Times magazine, Robert Moss, extreme right-wing editor of a dubious offshoot of Britain's Economist called Foreign Report, which specializes in sensational rumors from the world's intelligence agencies, asserts that Cambodia's pursuit of total revolution has resulted by the official admission of its head of state, Khu Sampan, in the slaughter of 1 million people. Moss offered no source for this official admission. We speculated that his source was probably the Reader's Digest, that noteworthy journal of cool and dispassionate political analysis, and Moss informed us in a personal letter that the suspicion was correct. Turning back to Moss's source, we read in Byron Paul's book, expanding their Reader's Digest article, Khu Sampan, as Cambodian chief of state, attended the Colombo Conference of Non-Aligned Nations in August 1976, and while there was interviewed by Italian weekly magazine Famiglia Cristiana, those traitors that remained have been executed, the magazine quoted him as saying. It further quoted him, in 5 years of warfare, more than 1 million Cambodians died. The current population of Cambodia is 5 million. Before the war, the population numbered 7 million. Barron and Paul then write that in response to a query as to the fate of the missing 1 million people, Q Sampan replied, "It is incredible how concerned you Westerners are about war criminals." They conclude that, if quoted accurately, Q Sampan indicated that between April 17, 1975, and the time of the interview in August 1976, roughly 1 million Cambodians died. Note that even if Q Sampan had indicated that 1 million Cambodians had died, that is not quite the same as an official admission of slaughter of 1 million people as a result of Khmer Rouge policy, as in Moss's rendition, which he saw no heed to correct when the discrepancy was pointed out to him. Ponchot's denial of the authenticity of the interview was in a letter of August 1977. The denial is particularly pertinent because Ponchot is cited as the sole independent non-governmental expert source in Barron and Paul's book. Furthermore, both Barron and Paul refer to their close association with Ponchot. In light of these facts, we have repeatedly asked Ponchot in personal letters to present publicly the details of this matter in view of his expressed devotion to the search for truth about the events in Cambodia, and the fact that the alleged interview is not only widely circulated and used as a basis for conclusions about Cambodian atrocities, but had even been offered on grounds for military intervention. In response to these requests, Ponchot sent a letter to John Barron stating what he knew of the facts. Unfortunately, he has refused permission to quote from this 5-page French letter unless it is quoted in its entirety, a requirement that in effect keeps it from public domain. We are therefore unable to offer this information about the alleged interview or other relevant matters. The matter is taken up by William Shawcross in an interview with Baron Paul. He points out that journalists who were present at Colombo, the site of the alleged interview with Paolo Brianta, say that none of them was ever able to get anywhere near Q Sampan. Two reporters have asserted flatly that she could not have gotten an interview and that it is a fake, though she sticks to her story. Note that in their book, Barron and Paul qualify their comment by saying, if quoted correctly, the qualification is certainly in order, if only because they initiate the Famiglia Christiana interview, if the interviewer not Q Sampan, who is alleged to have offered the 7 million figure. Furthermore, as they and others fail to note, Q Sampan explicitly denied the massacre reports in the interview. There is every reason to be skeptical as to whether there was such an interview, or if there was, whether the quotes are anywhere near accurate. It is doubtful that the journalists and others who have referred to Q Sampan's admission of 1 million deaths or 1 million slaughtered have even seen the original article in Famiglia Christiana, which is hardly a well-known source on international affairs. In fact, not a single copy of this journal is to be found in a library in the United States. The journal is a weekly published by the Pauline sisters and is primarily found in churches. It has apparently not occurred to the journalistic scholars, Cambodia specialists, intelligence analysts, and congressmen who have quoted or misquoted this interview to wonder why Q Sampan, at a time when the Cambodian government was not making extraordinary efforts to reach out to the Western world, should have chosen Paolo Brianti and Famiglia Christiana as the medium for approaching Western public opinion. Nor has it occurred to them to be skeptical about a chain of transmission that proceeds from Famiglia Christiana to the Reader's Digest and then to the international community, or to wonder why Q Sampan should have offered a figure of 5 million Cambodians when his government was estimating the population at about 7.7 million. Famiglia Christiana interview has not only been picked up by the U.S. press, congressmen, and intelligence analysts, but also by the foreign press and the scholarly literature. For example, The Economist gives the following version. When the Khmer Rouge leader Q Sampan was confronted by these stark statistics last summer, a 7 million population in 1970, an estimated 1 million killed during the war, a presumed 5 million people left in 1976, he replied blandly, "It is incredible how concerned you Westerners are about war criminals. What is incredible is how little foreign outrage these figures provoke." What is perhaps incredible is that The Economist should place sure reliance on this quote-unquote interview. No less incredible is the review of the Baron Paul book in the Far Eastern Economic Review by Donald Wise, which begins as follows. The scene call in the Non-Aligned Nations Conference, Colombo, August 1976. Then comes the Baron Paul mistranslation of the probably fabricated Famiglia Christiana interview, plus the inevitable comment that the world is not concerned about the genocide in Cambodia, his emphasis. Turning to the scholarly literature, Kenneth Quinn writes that the figure of 7.7 million offered by the Cambodian government was revised downward to 5 million by Khoo Sampan in an interview he gave to the Italian magazine Famiglia Christiana. Again, no qualification and no question about the choice. The Quinn account is perhaps independent of Baron Paul, given the dates and the fact that it does not offer the standard mistranslation by Baron Paul, contenting itself with misspelling and misrepresentation of the comments. Quinn was described in Asian Survey as a State Department representative on the National Security Council staff, as one of the experts who Baron and Paul have as having made data available to them and having guided us to other accounts, including perhaps this one. A year later, Professor Carl Jackson surveyed the situation in Cambodia, once again for Asian Survey, attempting to reconcile apparently conflicting claims about the grain problem. He suggests as one possibility that although food production has still not reached pre-war levels, it may suffice to feed a substantially reduced population, i.e. the 5 million people cited by Khoo Sampan in 1976, rather than the 8 million cited by various officials, including Pol Pot. His reference in Khoo Sampan's estimate is Donald Wise's review in the Far Eastern Economic Review, which begins by citing the Baron Paul mistranslation of that alleged Famiglia Christiana interview, which, to compound the absurdity, had already been cited in Asian Survey a year earlier by the State Department analysts, who may well have been the source for Baron Paul. No doubt the next reference to Khoo Sampan's admission will appear in an article by Quinn citing Jackson. A few months after the Khoo Sampan's now famous admission that his regime was responsible for the deaths of about 1/6 of the population of Cambodia, Indonesian Prime Minister Adam Malik admitted that 50 to 80,000 people, close to the same percentage of the population, had been killed in East Timor in the course of what the Indonesian propaganda ministry and the New York Times called the Civil War, quote unquote. That is the U.S.-backed Indonesian invasion and massacre, though one could not have discovered this fact from the U.S. media. While Khoo Sampan's admission was concocted by the media and scholarship on the basis of fanciful interpretation of remarks that quite possibly were never made, Malik's admission, by contrast, was clear and explicit. A comparison of the media reaction to the actual admission by Malik and the concocted quote-unquote admission by Khoo Sampan gives some insight into what lies behind the machinations of the free press. These examples, far from exhaustive, reveal how desperate Western commentators have been to find quote-unquote evidence that could be used in the international propaganda campaign concerning Cambodia. The credible reports of atrocities, and there were many, did not suffice for these purposes, and it was necessary to seek out the most dubious evidence. It hardly needs emphasis that journals of the quality and renown of Famiglia Christiana, or for that matter, the Reader's Digest, in the enemy camp would be regarded with utmost skepticism, if not dismissed outright, were they to offer comparable evidence about Western atrocities. In this case, the Famiglia Christiana quote-unquote interview bears all the earmarks of an intelligence fabrication of the type that the CIA is known to have indulged in repeatedly. Before turning to the next example cited by Simmons, let us consider the wise review of Baron Paul in the Far Eastern Economic Review cited above. To conclude the review, which began with Baron Paul mistranslation of the probably fabricated interview, Wise offers the following quote from a Cambodian official transmitted by Baron and Paul. To rebuild the new Cambodia, 1 million men is enough. Prisoners of war, people expelled from the cities and villages controlled by the government on April 17th, are no longer needed, and local chiefs are free to dispose of them as they please. Surely this is a damning indictment of Khmer Rouge, on par with Khoo Sampan's admission. So let us therefore examine it to determine whether it has any more credibility than the interview that has been so widely exploited to prove communist iniquity by Wise, among others. As we pursue the trail, we enter into a curious comedy of errors. What quote Wise's quote is from Baron Paul. Francis Ponchard, the noted French authority on Cambodia, reports that on January 26, the Anka official in the Mongkol Bore district declared to build a democratic Cambodia by renewing everything on a new basis, to do away with every reminder of colonial imperialist culture, whether visible or tangible or in a person's mind, to rebuild our new Cambodia. 1 million men is enough. Prisoners of war, people expelled from the cities and villages controlled by the government on April 17th, are no longer needed, and local chiefs are free to dispose of them as they please. Apart from this, from an insignificant error, Wise reproduces Baron Paul correctly. Baron Paul gives no source, but the source must be an article by Ponchard in Le Monde, where he asserts that a Khmer Rouge military chief made this statement in a directive to local authorities of a district on January 26, 1976. The accuracy of this translation has been challenged, but we will ignore this matter since far more serious doubts arise. Before turning to these, let us look into the identification of prisoners of war. Baron Paul quote the interpolated remark accurately from Ponchard. In an article in Le Monde on the preceding day, Ponchard makes the same point. He says that the refugees distinguish two categories of people: the old people from the regions liberated before 1975, and the new people liberated on April 17, 1975. These new people are always considered as prisoners of war and have no rights. The allegations appear in a somewhat different form in Ponchard's subsequent book. Here he writes that Khmer Rouge soldiers had more than enough to eat and refused themselves nothing. They had rice, meat, and fish in plenty, but they were withholding food from workers who were literally dying of hunger. Their reasoning was simple enough. You are prisoners of war. We went hungry for 5 years. Now it's your turn. No source is given for the latter quote, and no evidence is cited suggesting its general applicability. As we shall see, Ponchard uses the device of quotation with considerable abandon so that skepticism is in order about this particular case. Turning now to the quote given by Wise from Baron Paul, who cite Ponchard, note that they say Ponchard attributed it to an Anka official in January 26, 1976. In fact, he attributes it to a Khmer Rouge military chief who issued a directive to local authorities on January 26. In his subsequent book, which one would expect to be more careful and considered than a newspaper article, Ponchard does not give the quote at all. The sentiment surfaces only in the following quote: "Al safit de 102 millions de Junes pour faire la Campuchian nouveau." Literally, quote, 1 or 2 million young people are enough to build the new Cambodia. Not only have the numbers changed from 1 million men to 1 to 2 million young people, but so has the source. The quote is now attributed not to a Khmer Rouge military commander on January 26, 1976, but is rather given still in quotes as the formidable boast of the Khmer Rouge. The full context is this, quote, "The Khmer Rouges are coldly realizing their formidable boast." This statement closes the chapter entitled "The Cavalry of a People." Ponchard's statement in the book plainly implies that the Khmer Rouge are in the process of eliminating all but 1 or 2 million young people. That is a total of 5 to 7 million Cambodian people, including all who are not young, out of a population that he estimated at 8 million in 1970. A few lines earlier, Ponchard gives estimates of war debts, 600 to 800,000, and peace debts, note not killing but debts, ranging from 800,000 to 1.4 million. The higher estimates, allegedly from U.S. sources. The difference between approximately 1 million deaths and the elimination in process of some 5 to 7 million people a few lines later would seem significant. It is typical of the way Ponchard and others use numbers and their care with the distinction between killing and dying from disease and malnutrition caused by the war. Recall that the prediction from U.S. government sources that the numbers who would die from such causes would be on the order of 1 million. Elsewhere, Ponchard gives the alleged quote as follows: After stating that the number of post-war dead certainly exceeds 1 million, he writes, in the view of the revolutionaries, such a slaughter is no catastrophe. 1 or 2 million resolute young people are enough to reconstruct Cambodia, is a boast frequently used by cadres during meetings. Here again, the implication is that the revolutionaries would not be overly concerned with the massacre of many millions of people, the overwhelming mass of the population. In another publication from the same period, Panchad gives still another version of what appears to be the same quote. He writes, a Khmer Rouge stated, quote, if there should remain in Cambodia only 20,000 young people, we will build the new Cambodia with these 20,000. The numbers have changed once again, this time substantially, and there is no specific source. In this case, Panchad does not imply that the revolutionaries are in the process of eliminating all but 20,000 young people. We now have a number of versions of the alleged quote, which Panchad evidently regarded as of some significance, given its prominence in his writings in 1976 to 1977, and the conclusions he drew from it. In only one of these sources, Le Monde, is the quote specifically attributed to a Khmer Rouge military commander issuing a specific directive on a specific date. Who says that 1 million are enough? The rest can be disposed of. The Baron Paul translation, which Paul claims was proved by Panchad. Panchad gives the entire quote from this commander in italics in a separate paragraph in this Le Monde article, emphasizing its significance. The context, as well as the Baron Paul rendition, suggests that he must have had some text or other document. In other articles written at the same time and in Panchad's subsequent book, the context and the quote disappear. There is no reference to the alleged directive. Rather, a formidable boast to the Khmer Rouge is given without attribution, but in quotes. 1 or 2 million people, young people, will be enough to build the new society. Nothing is said about disposing of the remainder, but it is implied that the Khmer Rouge are eliminating them. In his review of the book, Lecoutre gives still a different version when men who talk of Marxism are able to say, as one quoted by Panchad does, that only 1.5 or 2 million young Cambodians out of 6 million will be enough to rebuild a pure society. One can no longer speak of barbarism, but only quote unquote madness. We mentioned the discrepancy between the Le Monde account and the book in the review article cited in note 100, adding that, quote, this is one of the rare examples of a quote that can be checked. The results are not impressive. In his letter commenting on the article, Panchad explained that the original Le Monde reference was based not on any text, but rather on a report by a refugee who said that he had heard this remark from the chief of the northwest region of Cambodia at a meeting. In our view, it would have been a good idea to state the source accurately in the original article. Panchad writes that he subsequently heard similar reports from refugees with numbers ranging from 100,000 to 2 million, and in a spirit of truth, give a more qualified account in his book without a specific source. Panchad interprets the alleged statements not as a firm wish to reduce Cambodia to 1 million people, but as expressing a resolution to purify Cambodia without taking into account people's lives. It is therefore more redoubtable boutade, a formidable boast, than an explicit affirmation of intention. We wonder whether under this interpretation, it is still proper to imply, as Panchad clearly did in his book, that the Khmer Rouge are in the process of eliminating 5 to 7 million people in accordance with this formidable boast. We continue to be unimpressed. This seems to us a curious way to use the device of quotation. Recall, this is one of the very few cases where an alleged quote can be checked, because in this instance, it was reported in at least 2 separate sources. We will see that other quotes are the subject of verification, fare no better on inquiry. To our minds, it raises serious questions about the authenticity of the quotations that are offered in what is, we again emphasize, the most serious of the critical work on post-war Cambodia. The reader will observe how this rather vague report of what someone is alleged to have said, subject to a qualified interpretation, has been transmuted into a firm declaration of genocidal policy in its long voyage from refugees to Panchad to Baron Paul, Lecoutre, and Wise. Apparently, Panchad has since had still further thoughts about the reference. It is deleted entirely from the American edition of his book, the one from which we have been quoting, but the long and dubious chain of transmission has left its part of quote unquote history. We mention specifically here the American translation, quote unquote, because curiously, the quote remains intact in the simultaneously British translation, where the last paragraph of chapter 4, the cavalry of a people, reads as follows. A large part of the deported population appears to have been sacrificed. Its role in the history of democratic Kampuchea will thus have been to build up the country's economic infrastructure with its own flesh and blood. Now a country of the pure should arise. 1 or 2 million people are enough to make the new Kampuchea, was the blood-chilling boast of the Khmer Rouge, which they are now grimly calling into a reality. The two sentences that we have italicized are omitted in the American edition. The British translation is perhaps a bit free, but both the French original and the British translation do clearly imply that the Khmer Rouge are in the process of cold-bloodedly eliminating something on the order of 5 to 7 million people. In the British edition, a slightly different version of Lecoutrer's misstatement of this quote or boast or whatever it may be, attributing it to men who talk of Marxism and concluding that it goes beyond barbarism, appears on the book's cover. In the American translation, it is entirely deleted from the book, along with the claim that some 5 to 7 million people, including all but the young, are being eliminated to build a country of the pure. We leave it to the reader to decide what to make of all of this. Some further skepticism about this quote or boast, quote unquote, aroused by the congressional testimony of State Department expert Charles Twining. The Khmer Rouge, sometimes on a local level, will tell villagers that we can afford to lose 1 or 2 million, even 2 million people. You hear this story often enough from enough places to make you think it has been handed down from on high. We can lose 1 to 2 million people if we must to create the new Cambodia. The reference is suspiciously familiar. In this case, the 1 to 2 million are not those who will be left, the others cold-bloodedly eliminated by the Khmer Rouge, according to Panchad's rather fanciful construction, which he has withdrawn, but rather those who may be lost. And the quote is not attributed, rather Twining surmises that it has been handed down from on high. It is a reasonable suspicion that this is a residue of the same alleged quote-unquote boast. At this point, one must really belong to the faithful to believe that there is anything at all in this whole story, and our trust in those who transmit it without qualification in various forms correspondingly diminishes. Yet another source for this garbled report is suggested by a Phnom Penh radio broadcast, Military Problems, in which it is explained how Cambodia can defeat the Vietnamese even though much outnumbered. Using these figures, 1 Kampuchean soldier is equal to 30 Vietnamese soldiers. If we have 2 million troops, there should be 60 million Vietnamese. For this reason, 2 million troops should be more than enough to fight the Vietnamese, because Vietnam has only 50 million inhabitants. We do not need 8 million people. We need only 2 million troops to crush 50 million Vietnamese, and we still would have 6 million people left. Again, this statement is suspiciously familiar. It may well be that there is any source at all for these various accounts. It is some sort of patriotic slogan formulated with various rhetorical flourishes. Wise is clearly much enamored in this quote. In the same House issue of the Far Eastern Economic Review, in which he reviewed Baron Paul, Wise has an article on Cambodia in which he explains that the, quote, new regime is too harsh for the formerly fun-loving, easygoing Cambodian. As evidence for the harshness, he writes that a senior Khmer Rouge official was officially quoted as saying that Cambodia needs no more than 1 million people to get started as its new course, and all prisoners, that is, people from zones occupied by the Khmer Rouge at the April 1975 ceasefire, are no longer required and may be disposed of as local commanders think fit. In a review of the English-British translation of Panchad's book, he cites once again in the following context: nobody can suggest a reliable figure for the peace dead, says Panchad, but it certainly exceeds 1 million. Yet the Khmer Rouge is boasted 1 or 2 million young people are enough to make the new Kampuchea. The implication is that the peace dead are victims of Khmer Rouge who boast of this massacre because 1 or 2 million people are all that are needed. Notice again how the facts, if any, have been skillfully transmuted in their passage through its Western pop propaganda system. In the first place, there is a serious question as to how many of the peace dead fall to the Western account rather than to of the Khmer Rouge. There is the further question whether the victims for whom the West does not bear direct responsibility are the victims of peasant revenge or coordinated policy of massacre. Finally, what of the boast, quote unquote, of the Khmer Rouge, which stands in dramatic contrast to their persistent denial of massacres and expressed commitment to building up the population to 15 to 20 million, question mark? This boast is Wise's version of Panchad's version of a variously attributed remark that has dissolved upon inquiry. Note again that it is a central element of his review of both Baron Paul and Panchad, and that he has also cited in a separate article. It has apparently never occurred to him to wonder why the quote he repeats is given and attributed differently in these two sources, or to inquire further into its authenticity on these grounds. In such ways as these, the Western system of indoctrination spins its web of deceit. Okay, so that's it. We've stopped. It's 45 pages. We stopped at page 211. So I'm going to make some comments here, some comments, quick comments. We started on page 165. We wanted to talk about, the Wall Street Journal. So we talked about Lecouter's article, Lecouter's statement, for whom the facts are simply irrelevant nuisance, like the editors of the Wall Street Journal. Basically, while the latter reaction merits no comments, Lecouter's is not so quickly dismissed, though we feel that it is deeply wrong in the case of an investigation of post-war Cambodia and entirely untenable if one is concerned. We are, as we are here, with the workings of Western propaganda. So the whole topic we're talking about is, the auto-genocide that Lecouter put forth, the auto-genocide that Lecouter stated was, happening. First of all, the genocide of Cambodia was a result of U.S. bombings. We say specifically here, U.S. bombs, and then taking revenge against the urban civilization that they regarded not without reason as a collaborator in their destruction and their long history of repression by the United States government, mafia, warmonger, war criminal, white gangsters. That is what ultimately that he is saying. He is saying that, this auto-genocide, was the Cambodians, but it is actually the United States government that, committed the genocide against the Cambodian people, a racist group of white warmonger, war criminal, mafia butchers. So continuing on, we got another statement here, Chandler's comments. We wanted to talk about this. Foreign Services Officer David Chandler, who is a lecturer at Monash University in Australia, said that what drove the Cambodians to kill, paying off old scores or imaginary ones played a part, but to a large extent, I think, American actions are to blame. From 1969 to 1973, we dropped more than 500,000 tons of bombs on the Cambodian countryside. Nearly half of this tonnage fell in 1973. In those few months, we may have driven thousands of people out of their minds. We certainly accelerated the course of revolution. According to several accounts, the leadership hardened its ideology and got rid of wavering factions during 1973 and 1974. We bombed Cambodia without knowing why, without taking note of the people we destroyed. And it is ironic, to use a colorless word, for us to accuse the Cambodians of being indifferent to life when, for so many years, Cambodian lives made so little difference to us. And then Chandler's comments were refuted by, the U.S. congressional mafia gangster William Goodling. Our bombs didn't single out a certain segment of certain peoples in Cambodia. Our bombs hit them all, and whether you thought it was right or I thought it was right, the military at that particular time, it was right. Who is the United States government, the racist mafia gangsters, to commit a genocide and then say that they question whether they are right? They are mafia gangsters, murderous butchers of the American government, racist murderers of the American government, and it's mafia congressional, people. That's ultimately what that little statement was. That we talk about William Buckley. All right, so we were talking about William Buckley, the Asian mind, the Asian tropes, that they are, fanatic people. The Khmer people are, just fatalist, tinged with fatalism, passivity, and an underlying confidence in the abilities of those in power. Nationalism. Basically, William Buckley stating that the difficulty with resort to the mysterious Asian mind, the difficulty The allegations that the population is groaning under the heels of the conqueror is because William Buckley explains the difficulty away with resort to the mysterious Asian mind. Nationalism carried out to such lengths is utterly alien to the Western experience. The Cambodian sticks to the rule. The Khmer people respect authority with a respect that to us is tinged with fatalism, even passivity, but that emanates an underlying confidence in the ability of those in power. The underlying ideology may come from somewhere else, but the methods employed show every mark of Cambodian culture, and Khmer makes it possible for the authorities to rule the countryside with terror and lies. And under Marxist influence, perhaps the Khmer will suddenly open a critical eye. Another cause of the radicality of the Khmer Revolution lies in the Khmer way of reasoning, which is bewildering to Cartesian minds. The Khmer thinks by accretions and juxtapositions, but adheres to strictly the rule of internal logic, apparently incapable of Cartesian logic. The non-specialist may wonder about the cogency of these explanations of the, quote, difficult question that government specialists rightly find troubling. It is noteworthy that the varied attempts to find a solution to this most difficult question, one conceivable hypothesis does not seem to have been considered, even to be rejected, that there was a significant degree of peasant support for the Khmer Rouge and the measures that they had instituted in the countryside. So basically, the U.S. government wants to depose the regime because they are, a group of mafia, racist gangsters, mass murdering racist, war criminal gangsters. So additionally, we wanted to talk about the situation from the U.S. war. We're going to talk about aid stockpiles of rice. Director of the aid program estimated Phnom Penh alone 1.2 million people were in desperate need of United States food aid, although 640,000 people were actually receiving some form of United States food support, and starvation was widely reported. Goodfellow correctly assigned the responsibility for this impending famine. It was caused primarily by the U.S. bombing campaign, which shattered the agrarian economy, an unquestionable fact that has since quietly been forgotten. So read the books, understand the facts. The U.S. bombing campaign resulted in the genocide of the Cambodian people, not the Khmer Rouge regime. Continuing on, we basically consider again what lies behind the military call for it. Okay, so we wanted to also say, here is another little thing. The horrendous situation in Phnom Penh, as elsewhere in Cambodia, as the war drew to an end, was a direct and immediate consequence of the U.S. assault. Prior to the U.S. actions that drew Indochina into the Indochina War, Cambodia into the Indochina War, the situation was far from ideal, contrary to the colonialist myth about happy peasants. But it was nothing like the accounts just reviewed by congressional study missions and health and relief workers. The same is true of the vast destruction of agricultural lands and drought animals, peasant villages, and communications, not to speak of the legacy of hatred and revenge. The United States bears primary responsibility for these consequences of its intervention. All of this is forgotten when sole responsibility is assigned to the Khmer Rouge for deaths from malnutrition and disease. And it is as if some Nazi apologists were to condemn the Allies for post-war deaths from starvation and disease in DP camps. Though the analogy is unfair to the Nazis compared to the United States, since the Allies at least had the resources to try to deal with the Nazi legacy. So the U.S. government is worse than the Nazis, he is saying. Continuing on, the Western press has poured forth reams of denunciations of Cambodia in the most strident tones, repeating the most extreme denunciations, that often on flimsy evidence, into striking contrast to its behavior in the case of massacres elsewhere, as in East Timor. The U.S. press is particularly notable for a marked double standard in this regard, though it is hardly alone, and there is good reason why Aikman, who fails to mention of those political theorists who have defended the Cambodian tragedy, as this would require differentiating those who have exposed media distortions and tried to discover the facts, instead of joining the bandwagon of uncritical abuse from those who say that no serious atrocities have occurred, a smaller, non-existent set that time has searched for, apparently without success. Specifically, also might require publicizing the views of critics of the current propaganda barrage, which would make it difficult to avoid discussions of crucial U.S. role in post-war suffering and deaths in Cambodia, or of the actual nature of what time regards as quote-unquote evidence. For Time ideologists, the defenders of the Cambodian tragedy is of one who fails to place all the blame for post-war suffering on the Khmer Rouge and who otherwise contest the patriotic truths handed down by Reader's Digest and similar sources. So basically, that's regarding Aikman's article in Time magazine, a racist, fraud that Time published on July 31st, 1971, Cambodian, an experiment in genocide by David Aikman. Continuing on, basically, Dudman reports the constant indiscriminate bombing by the United States, racist mafia gangsters, and estimated 450,000 dead and wounded civilians, to say nothing of military casualties, of the estimated 4 million refugees, was almost inevitable result of the short U.S. invasion of Cambodia and its subsequent proxy war that ended in defeat for the United States as well as for the client regime in Phnom Penh. Relying in part on his personal experience in captivity, he adds that the U.S. invasion spread the communist-led guerrillas through most of Cambodia and drew Vietnamese communists and the Cambodian population into an alliance as comrades in arms against a common racist enemy of the United States, tanks and bombs, which were a catalyst. So that's, an additional thing. And there was one more statement, basically Time. Okay, so Time, this is a photograph. We talked about the photograph, photographs of produced Time printed photographs, fabrications, U.S. press, fabrication of photographs of Indochina, the Khmer Rouge executing people, all sorts of fabricated photographs printed in Thailand, respect to the Thai, socialists, and then, reprinted in Time saying the Khmer Rouge was responsible for atrocities. Again, the standard theme, the U.S. racist mafia journalism of fabrication, falsification, deception, and deliberate lies. So that was that. The Time photograph was a huge part of it. And then we saw, basically Famiglia Christiana, another interview with, the Khmer Rouge, basically stating that, the government, wanted to reduce the population to 20,000. The reports, just vary, just continuous fabrications go from, we want to reduce to 5 million to 20,000 young people. That's all that was required. So we were saying that, they were going to genocide between 2 million and 6 million. Basically fraud, just racist, garbage statistics by the U.S. government and its mafia journalism wing and its, European friends of, Christiana, Famiglia Christiana, which were, Famiglia Christiana was a Italian magazine. So, so basically just, shooting in the dark, garbage ideas, garbage thought process, pretty much, the standard stuff, just, a racist war of, warmonger, white mafia, murderous gangsters. So again, after the cataclysm, Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman, post-war reconstruction and the, post-war Indochina and the reconstruction of imperial ideology, political economy of human rights. Please join me tomorrow for a second episode. I'm going to finish with, 5 minutes of a, completion. So we begin with Khampay Boupha, the Lao foreign minister who reacted to Jimmy Carter's denial of aid to Laos and the racist humanitarians of the U.S. government, like Carter, who elicit suspicion among the Laotians for U.S. human rights crusade. Mr. Boupha notes correctly that the U.S. Congress racist, murderous butchers opposition to American aid to Laos, including direct and indirect aid during his meeting with Frederick Brown of the U.S. State Department, questioned American commitment to human rights. He notes 3 million tons of bombs, white phosphorus, mustard gas, sarin gases, vomiting gases that killed and maimed hundreds and thousands of people and forced the people to abandon their fields. Unexploded ordinance was another aggressive criminal act by the U.S. mafia gangsters. He stated quite accurately that the U.S. humanitarian concern by refusing to help heal the wounds of war is not a humanitarian gesture, but is, in my view, more of a mafia gesture of murderous warmonger butchers. Henry Kam of the New York Times, fraudulent story on Mio villages being attacked by Laos and bombed and genocide the Hmong and clandestine army and Mio that the CIA had contracts with. The abysmal record of U.S. journalism in Laos is described as fabrication and omitting the American hand, even if a long tradition of U.S. state terrorism and violence prevail. American Times readers will not read it, though an expose may come years removed when the American mafia's dirty work is long finished and the CIA is reformed in keeping with American justice, democracy, and freedom for white fabrication. Cam does not describe the U.S. commitment to the Mio who had contracted and trapped them like desperate dogs and throwing away their leash when they lost their usefulness. The U.S. gun violent, backstabbing assassins, the third world oppression, approach to just wars and rules of war, throw away colored third world allies when no longer useful and resort back to American racism. We also discussed the article in the New York Times by Henry Cam on March 21st, 1977, on Father Galinas, who epitomized American rumor journalism and statistical guesswork as gospel when he reported 20,000 mass suicides in Vietnam under the communist regime as a way to describe communist tyranny. Further check was not done by the rumor propagators of American mafia journalism, and his number was reported repeatedly in the U.S. press as gospel. He derived his number from secondhand conversation by nurses and suicidees in a hospital that he had visited, and the nurse or suicidee had indicated mass suicides and hundreds of bodies. He then took the number and multiplied it by the number of hospitals in Saigon and extrapolated 20,000 members, which is white guesswork and numeric fraud. Secondhand information by the U.S. press and rumor journalism of the New York Times allowed rumor about mass suicides in an attempt to draw sympathy from the Europeans, who were already racist and biased against the Vietnamese. This embodies white fraud, racist U.S. government propaganda system. And we also talked about American academia frauds of Samuel Huntington, stating that war dissent in the United States, was resulting in a crisis of democracy and that it should be suppressed through fascist murder and brutal torture, which the U.S. government, warmonger, mafia, white war criminal butchers, back. Lamont Perengou, French racist, murderous, pro-colonial fascists, less made up lies about systematic recourse and repression, preventative arrest on simple suspicion, denunciation, and camps within the Vietnamese, North Vietnamese, communist government, white gossip and fraud by French Western racist press. We described falsely, greatly exaggerated the white gossip and non-communist activists, and avoided addressing non-communist activists who were courageously devoted to defense of political prisoners under former regime, they spoke out about silence and full South Vietnamese prisons that were full with torture, not hideous. The Toronto Globe, John Fraser found the numbers were completely fabricated by Perengau of Le Monde, and that it was completely changed. So again, basically the racist American government, murderous butchers, and their European mafia, white criminal gangsters, and the U.S. government, colonial fascist butchers for enslavement, use statistical guesswork, fictional numbers as gospel, and gross fabrications and extrapolations to paint a picture of communist tyranny in the Indo-Chinese places, which is marked there, mafia, war criminal, warmonger gangsters. Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank and Del Rey Beats. Please join me tomorrow for the next 45 pages. Have a great day.